Making a fortune is hard. Leaving it behind without making enemies, now that's a skill. Today, what leaving generational wealth really means and why Gen 2 struggles, and the do's and absolutely do nots. Hey everyone, Tommy Derfler, Sam Rice here in the Lighthouse Wealth Group Spotlight Podcast. This is our final series of the one of three series talking about generational wealth. And today we're going to be discussing the leaving generational wealth, how to do it and what it means.
Thanks, Tommy. So to kick this off, how do we want to start this? How do we want to define what generational wealth really means?
Yeah, generational wealth is simply just the passing of wealth from one generation. And I'll say this, substantial wealth. Substantial wealth from one generation to the next in a way that's, efficient, smooth, avoiding taxes in a way that the new generation, generation 2, can hopefully manage it well.
Awesome. And then, so when you're thinking of that, what are some of the biggest struggles from that generation 2 pass down?
Yeah, I think, one, to leave good generational wealth, most people think it's just, hey, I have estate planning documents, I've got a will, I've got power of attorneys, they may even have a trust. And really, those are the fundamental. Those estate planning documents are really the fundamental part. All that does is say, hey, this leaves this wealth in a way to hopefully mitigate taxes and at the same time go to where it needs to go, hopefully without going through probate. But, a lot of times when you leave that substantial amount of wealth, you're not just leaving money, you're leaving a system for the family to run on without you. You're leaving, core values. You're leaving a sense of purpose. And that's what we're going to touch on today is less of the technical side, the tax mitigation and the estate planning and so on, even though that's equally important, but really discussing what that system really means and how it works.
And so going from the first generation, thinking towards how they accumulated this, what are some of the things that they focus on? What are some of the things that they ignore?
Oh, yeah. So generation 1 are usually wealth creators in this situation. And the things they focus on is they focus on taking risk of some sort, right? That really means starting a business, creating something, building an asset, real estate empire, whatever it may be. But those Gen 1 usually take on a risk, and they're high performers, hard drivers. They're really good at deal making. They're really good at building an asset. And so they do that. They have great work ethic. A lot of times, the other spouse handles the family and runs the family while they're building the assets. But I think the biggest thing that generation 1 does is they create all these things, but they don't know how to leave it behind. And so a lot of times, because you're generation 1, you're just creating this thing, you don't know how to pass it down in a way that somebody else knows how to manage it, because there's a huge difference between managing it, which we talk about in the second series of this 3-part series. And there's a big difference between wealth creation and wealth management. And so
That's right.
Generation 1 doesn't really understand, okay, just do what I did. How many times have we heard that in meetings? Like, oh, well, this is what I did, just do this. And it's like, well, that's great. That got us up to here. But now what gets us here to the next level is not going to be just do what you did. It's going to be having to say, hey, what kind of systems do we have in place? Such as like mission. Do we have a family mission? What is the point of this wealth? Is it for lifestyle, to create certain lifestyles for everyone? Is it to maintain a certain level of philanthropy? Is that important in the community? So knowing what they're managing and having that clear sense of purpose or mission statement is really big for the second generation to know and understand. And so, what generation 1 doesn't know is, okay, how do I how do I prep the next generation to manage this? And so I remember there's a story that a friend told me, and basically they had generational wealth, and the Gen 1 was a typical patriarch, right? Hard driver, high performer, deal maker, very good at business. And so grew up without money, took the risk, did all these things. And so the message being passed down to generation 2 was don't spend money, don't spend money, don't spend money, be frugal, be frugal. Well, by the time it got to the point where generation 1 was on their deathbed, the second generation wasn't ready to management because all they heard was don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Instead of, hey, what the reality of the situation was, they were always going to have more than enough. They were always going to have more than enough. So they were never going to have a spending issue in this particular case. But what the second generation basically told is, I need to understand how to manage it, not just not to spend it.
Don't be afraid of this burden. Think of it as stewardship.
Lean into this. And so they already had the values of being frugal because that's the way they lived their life growing up. And so it was a matter of saying, listen, I'm not going to grow up the same situation you did where you didn't have anything. Now we're always going to have something. But how do I steward this well? That's what the second generation really needed to understand, that the first generation, quite honestly, really couldn't teach them because they didn't know.
They only knew I think this is interesting too, they only knew their level of frugal that they grew up with. When the second generation, you may be frugal, but if you have $100 million or 50, even living off, honestly, $500,000 a year, that you could still say that's kind of frugal depending on the responsibilities that you may have within a family dynamic.
Yeah, 100%. And so for the second generation, it was a matter of saying, okay, the first generation ran on instinct, right? Ran on that gut feeling and risk. The second generation works on and runs off agreements. So, siblings have to learn to work together. They have to learn how to understand what their roles are. They have to understand, where do spouses come in all of a sudden? You know what I mean? Where are the in-laws? What kind of role do they have in this? What kind of say do they have in this? And so you have to make sure that there's systems running and things in place in order to have these very healthy discussions, which are, by the way, super awkward at first. And the goal isn't perfection in your first meeting. But if you have family quarterly meetings, for instance, a lot of this stuff comes out, and all of a sudden now what could be really bad conflicts by not talking about it is now brought to the table, hashed out, debated, and hopefully have a resolve to it to where everybody walks away thinking, okay, now we're all still united. We understand what this entails, and we're on the same page as much as you can be.
Yeah, it's like you don't want to have the first time you have this conversation to be potentially on somebody's deathbed. You want to ease people into this over years, ideally. People have different strengths, different roles, like you talked about within a family, and this wealth becomes its own family business, maybe even aside from another family business that generated this wealth, right?
Yeah.
You've got two things to protect at this point. And then, so going deeper into that, what is a perfect handoff, as an advisor from what you've seen look like?
The perfect handoff. I don't think really that exists, but I think some of the things that I've seen that work really, really well is constant communication.
Yeah.
Especially, when you look at from Gen 1 to Gen 2, that's probably one of the most important handoffs. It kind of determines what that looks like for the rest of the generations. But the perfect handoff is just constant communication. A lot of times that is the Gen 1 telling their story. Here's what got us here. It could be, hey, I learned to manage risk. I learned when to take risk, when not to take risk, especially regarding a private business. I learned how to mitigate risks to certain degrees. I learned how to put systems in place to make decisions, good decisions. I knew who to surround myself with in order to make good decisions. So it wasn't just me in a vacuum by myself trying to figure this out. It's keeping the accountability around me. And so a lot of times that first generation loves to tell their story. And frankly, the second generation, from what I've seen, really likes to hear it because they don't talk about that much. They just talk about what every parent talks about, which is do this, don't do this, do this, do this, don't do this.
You're being the parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So being in a position of storytelling, it's not so direct. And I think the second generation really picks up on a lot more than the generation one really would think that they would, just by telling the story to say, hey, here's where we came from. We came from nothing. I learned to be frugal at a young age. I learned to save a good amount of money. I learned what it meant to also give when we had extra. Maybe we didn't have enough to give, we still gave, and we saw the importance of that. And so, we got financial literacy. So all those things are being passed down, and being able to communicate that in a way that, kids, or I'll say the adult kids, need to hear if they don't know it already.
Yeah. And, we touched on this a little bit before. And I think as that second generation becomes adults, hopefully they're older as their parents get older, and you can have some of these more mature conversations, understanding of that transfer and that stewardship and that responsibility. You can talk to them as, more equals on a playing field. Like, this is going to become your responsibility, and less so like a child where, we have to be in this together. So this survives longer than all of us.
Yeah. The other thing too is just kind of saying, hey, what works is mission statement, a family mission statement. What does the family believe in? What are the things that unites the family? Is it philanthropy? Is it work ethic? Is it education? What is it that's very, very important to the family that needs to be passed down? What is the purpose of managing and stewarding this money well? What does that mean? What does that look like? Painting that picture as much as you can. The other thing is making sure the next generation know who the important advisors are. Who is our wealth advisor? We need to have a relationship with that team.
Yeah.
Who's the banker that deals with our family business, or assets or real estate company? Who is the attorney, for the estate planning documents? What does it say in the estate planning documents?
Where are they?
Where are they? That's probably really important,
Yeah.
What do we own and where is it all?
Yeah. That's always, you hear that in any passing situation. It's, you help people go through a checklist, and then you just find out more and more stuff come through the woodworks in some cases.
Yeah. And, we get asked the question a lot too of, hey, when do I start addressing this with the kids, right? Meaning Gen 2. And this is where you just have to use good judgment. We've seen parents that said, hey, at a very young age, as soon as they can kind of comprehend money, we get started doing chores around the house. Sometimes you tend to give allowances. Some people don't, but you start instilling something to their understanding of, hey, this is how money works, and they
saving, earning, work, that kind of thing.
Giving. Absolutely. And then some people say, hey, we didn't have that opportunity. Our kids are grown right now. So now what do we do? Well, you start having the conversation where everything is. What happens if mom were to pass away? What happens if dad were to pass away? And as uncomfortable and emotional as these conversations can be, it pays huge dividends at the end of the day. It's one of the best gifts you can give your kids is, hey, when this thing passes, we need you to know who the estate planning attorney is. Call this person. call this person. They know where
Yeah.
everything is. They know how to handle it. They will help you. They will guide you.
Yeah. That's what they're there for. I mean, along with us, right? We do those. Estate planning attorneys would do that. Happy to be that middleman in to kind of brush those conversations along.
Yeah. So making sure you know who the advisors are, where everything is, and getting a deeper understanding of, hey, what's the purpose of stewarding this? And I think if you can do a combination of all of those things, then you're certainly on the right track.
All right. So that's a good ideal handoff. Okay. Switching gears now, what would you absolutely not do? What would be a terrible way to set this up? Generational wealth, things you shouldn't do.
I guess the easy answer is just do the opposite of everything I just said, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Don't communicate. Don't say anything. Leave the kids in the dark.
A surprise will.
Yeah, having a surprise will. Secrecy usually breeds lawsuits, you know. But I think one thing too is don't mistake equal for fair. Don't mistake equal for fair, because every child will have different needs. Some will need more of some support, financial support, than others. Some
more safeguards.
Some can handle more responsibility than the others. Mm-hmm. So don't mistake equal for fair or fair for equal either. You know, I think you have to look at each one of the kids in that next generation independently and saying, hey, who can handle what, who needs certain needs here. And so that can look different for everybody. And then I think what's important too is saying, having those, you know, not having a mission statement. And, you know, some people say, well, you know, I'm not going to have a financial legacy to leave. Well, that's okay. But you certainly want to leave. Do you want to leave a legacy of work ethic? Do you want to leave a legacy of, hey, education is important? Do you want to leave a legacy of having a sense of humor when life just slaps you upside down a little bit? You know, so don't think it has to be all financially related, even though obviously in this case, more than likely it is, especially with generational wealth. But, you know, it can be something that's just meaningful to you that, you know, you want to be able to pass down as far as the intangibles, not necessarily the financial tangibles.
Yeah. And, you know, like what you're saying, fair doesn't have to be equal and vice versa. There's many cases too where you see this with billionaires all the time, where the substantial amount of their wealth actually goes to charities and philanthropy. Their family actually gets a small portion of their overall wealth, and that's fine too. But they're understanding through their life the literacy and the values that their parents had, and that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, another thing I just thought of too is, you know, when talking about leaving the legacy of the next generation, depending where you are in the generational wealth cycle, you know, I think if not just from Gen 1 to Gen 2, but maybe it's from Gen 4 to 5 or 6, if it goes that far. But a lot of times is having certain criteria and boundaries and rules on how to make decisions. And so how much do you think the next generation ought to spend?
Maybe you safeguard it, something where the second generation or the third could potentially even only have access to ever 80% of this wealth, so that 20% is always left over for 2 or 3 generations on.
Yeah, or the other way you could do is just doing spending bans, right? And saying, hey, listen, we've got this huge asset here, but you know what? You take out 4 to 5% a year. That's all you'll need on your spending, your lifestyle. That will be more than enough. And then steward the rest in a way that represents those values in that mission statement. But the other thing too is also in those later generations, you know, I use the example of 4, 5, and 6, that not addressing the in-laws and spouses or blended families.
Yes.
You know, a lot of times when you get to that point, if you're kind of 3rd, 4th, 5th generation, and all of a sudden you're bringing spouses into this whole new financial situation, you know, a lot of times they need guidance. And a lot of times they need to have a little bit of say. And, you can create safeguards with that, right? Nobody wants to have somebody come in and hijack the family wealth. Nobody wants that, of course. But
Yeah.
to be able to ignore the in-laws and spouses, I think would be another mistake too.
Awesome. Well, to wrap this up, any other good quick snapshots or examples you want to throw in there, or?
I think what we are trying to convey here, that if you look at a lot of the families, the Rockefellers, the Rothschild, the Vanderbilts, and so on, they're prime examples of this family wealth. And, you have certain families, the Rockefeller group, that created the family office and created the structure very early on, just because their wealth was so massive. They did a great job of this, and I think for the Vanderbilts, I think I read somewhere that in 1973 they had a family get together and none of them were millionaires anymore, right? And so it kind of tells you, even with that massive wealth, it doesn't take long to go through that money, whether it be just, not having these things that we talked about, I think is a good way for that to squander the money, the generational wealth. And so I think from, Sam, you and I's perspective, creating that wealth is one of the hardest things to do, but man, making sure to manage that in a way that just really helps future generations and really helps your value system and creates what started as a creek now is growing to a huge river, and I think that's just what we enjoy helping people with, is that ability to make sure, hey, let's look at this as a stewardship. Let's steward this correctly.
Yeah, I mean, we've created something amazing. Let's protect it from every outside threat, whether it could be lawsuit, other family, new family, all those things in between. That's the hard part, keeping it.
Yes. So awesome. Well, we appreciate everybody for being on here, the Lighthouse Wealth Group podcast, the spotlight, and please like, subscribe. Feel free to give us a call if you have any questions, 629-654-7190. Feel free to check out our website, www.lighthousewealthgroup.com. We appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next episode.
See you next time.